Okay, let's go. Number 1. Machu Picchu. You arrive at the ridge before the sun does. The clouds sit below you, not above, a white ocean filling the valleys on every side. From 7,970 feet above sea level, you watch the fog burn away, and as it goes, walls appear. Stone walls. Precise, interlocked, gray-green in the early light. A city emerges from the cloud as if the mountain grew it there, as if the rock simply decided to become architecture one morning around 1450 CE, and no one had the authority to question it. This is Machu Picchu. The official account says the Inca Emperor Pachacuti built it. Historians agree it was built without wheels, without iron tools, and without draft animals capable of working at this altitude. The alpacas and llamas of the Andes lose effective load-bearing capacity above 7,000 feet. The city sits at nearly 8,000 feet. Every stone that exists here was carried to this ridge by human hands on human backs, up a slope with a gradient that averages 40 degrees. The granite blocks fit together with tolerances of less than 1/25 of an inch. No mortar was used. No binding material of any kind. The stones are shaped so precisely that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. Modern structural engineers who have studied the joints describe them as dry-fitted to tolerances that would be considered acceptable in contemporary precision construction. The tools that produced these joints, according to mainstream archaeology, were bronze chisels and stone hammers. Here's where engineers still can't fully agree. The largest blocks at Machu Picchu weigh 14 tons. 14 tons, carried to a ridge at 7,970 feet, up a 40-degree slope, using tools made of a metal softer than the stone being cut. The site contains more than 150 structures. The total mass of stone moved to this ridge, across the construction period, exceeds 26,000 tons. There are no contemporary accounts of how this was done. The Inca had no writing system. What they left was the stone itself. The Intihuatana stone sits at the highest point of the site. It's a carved granite post set at a precise angle so that at solar noon on the spring and fall equinoxes, the sun casts no shadow. Not approximately no shadow. No shadow. The astronomical precision required to place a stone like that at an altitude where the sun's angle changes predictably but subtly requires either extraordinary calculation or a body of observational data accumulated over generations. The Inca built the stone to match the sun. They did not move the stone after the fact. Water flows through the city via a channel system that begins at a spring on the mountainside above the site. The channel carries water 2,457 feet along the ridge at a consistent gradient, supplying 16 fountains arranged in a line down the slope. Engineers who analyzed the channel in 2009 found the gradient varied by less than 3% across its entire length, cut through granite on a mountain face. The channel works today, 570 years after it was built. The Spanish conquistadors reached Cusco in 1533. They occupied the Inca capital, cataloged its treasures, interrogated its survivors, and documented its history with obsessive colonial thoroughness. They never found Machu Picchu. The city sat at 7,970 feet, 50 miles from Cusco by straight line, surrounded by communities who knew it was there and said nothing for 378 years. When Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911, guided not by academic research but by a local child named Pablito Alvarez who simply walked him there, the surrounding agricultural communities had maintained the terraces in continuous use. The city had not been forgotten by the people who lived near it. It had been hidden from the people who would have destroyed it. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Dedicated labor organization, engineering solutions developed through centuries of Andean building tradition, and a state capable of mobilizing thousands of workers under the META system of obligatory labor. It's a reasonable account. What it doesn't address is the precision. Ramp systems and organized labor explain how you move 14 tons of stone. But they don't explain why every single joint across 150 structures is under 1/25 of an inch when the structural requirements of the building don't demand that tolerance. A wall stands up just as well with a 1/4-inch gap. These builders close the gap anyway, every time. The question isn't just how. How do you develop the knowledge to cut granite to sub-millimeter tolerances, route water at a consistent gradient across 2,457 feet of mountain face, and align a stone to eliminate its shadow at the equinox using tools made of bronze, with draft animals that can't breathe at your elevation. How long does that knowledge take to accumulate? When did it start? And what else was built to those tolerances that we haven't found yet, still hidden in the cloud below this ridge? From a Peruvian ridgeline, at nearly 8,000 feet, we move to 2,700 feet in a Jordanian desert, where a different civilization solved the same problem, building the impossible by hiding their city inside a crack in the earth. Number 2. Petra. You walk into a crack in the earth. The sandstone cliffs close around you until the sky above is a thin ribbon of blue, barely 10 feet wide. The walls rise 200 feet on either side, pink and amber and blood orange, streaked with geological layers laid down before mammals existed. You walk for a mile in this slot canyon, the Sikh, the corridor hearing your own footsteps echo off stone that has been here since before the city you're walking toward was imagined. Then the canyon curves, and through the gap, you see it. Columns. A carved facade, 140 feet tall and 88 feet wide. The treasury of Petra, Al-Khazne, appears at the end of the Sikh, as if someone placed it there to stop your heart. At 2,700 feet above sea level in the desert of southern Jordan, carved directly into rose-red sandstone, a city announces itself by making you walk through a mile of controlled suspense to reach it. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, which controlled the intersection of trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, the Incense Road. At its height, between roughly 100 BCE and 100 CE, the city housed between 20,000 and 30,000 people. The Nabateans chose this location deliberately. A city hidden inside a basin surrounded by cliff walls is a city that armies have trouble finding and a city they have trouble entering even if they do. What makes Petra impossible at 2,700 feet in a desert is water. There is no permanent water source inside the city basin. The nearest springs are outside the cliffs. Yet Petra supported 30,000 people continuously for centuries. The Nabatean engineers solved this by building one of the most sophisticated water collection and distribution systems the ancient world produced. They cut channels into the cliff faces along the Sikh to capture flash floodwater, a phenomenon that turns desert wadis into lethal torrents for minutes at a time and then vanishes. Those channels directed water into cisterns carved into the bedrock throughout the city. Check dams slowed the surge. Settling tanks removed sediment. The system managed rainfall across 400 square miles of desert and stored it underground at 2,700 feet of elevation in a city concealed inside stone. The high place of sacrifice complicates things further. It sits at 3,760 feet, 1,000 feet above the main city basin, accessible via a stone staircase carved directly into a sheer cliff face. 900 steps, some wider than your shoulders, some barely that, rising at angles that require both hands in certain sections. At the summit, a flat-topped altar with carved channels to drain blood, ritual basins cut from the living rock, and 2 standing obelisks left standing when the surrounding stone was removed to create the platform. Someone decided that sacrifice needed to happen at exactly 3,760 feet, reached by exactly these 900 steps. Then they built the staircase to make it so. The temperature inside Petra's carved rooms stays constant, regardless of desert surface conditions. The Nabateans used this to store perishable trade goods, particularly balsam resin, which made up a significant portion of their commerce. Passive climate control, achieved by carving rooms deep enough into the cliff face to use the stone as thermal mass. This is not primitive. This is engineering that required understanding of thermal dynamics, of the relationship between depth and temperature, of how much stone you need between an interior space and the desert sun. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt entered Petra for the Western world in 1812 by disguising himself as a Muslim pilgrim, speaking Arabic he'd learned specifically for the purpose, and talking his way in on the pretext of making a sacrifice at the nearby tomb of the prophet Aaron. He was the first Westerner in living memory to enter the site. The city had been protected not by remoteness, locals knew exactly where it was, but by generations of Bedouin who understood that Western discovery meant Western interference, and kept the canyon to themselves. The mainstream explanation for Petra is trade wealth. The Nabatean monopoly on incense route commerce funded construction that would otherwise seem impossible. This is reasonable as far as it goes. but the water system extends 400 square miles beyond the city walls. You don't build a 400 square mile water capture network purely because you can afford to. You build it because you understood systematically, with precision that required both engineering knowledge and accumulated observational data, how to move water through a desert at altitude and store it where it couldn't evaporate. Where did that understanding come from? Only 15% of Petra has been excavated. Satellite imaging, conducted by NASA in 2016, revealed a previously unknown monumental platform buried beneath the surface, south of the main city center, 184 feet long and 161 feet wide, visible only from directly above. A structure that size had sat in a city visited by archaeologists since 1812, and no one knew it was there. What else is in the 85% that no one has opened? What sits beneath the canyon floor that the Nabateans specifically chose, at 2,700 feet in a desert, as the place to put their capital? And why did they build the entrance as a mile-long corridor designed to reveal the city only at the very last possible moment? From Jordan's hidden basin, we move north and east to the Himalayas, where a monastery clings to a cliff face at 10,240 feet, in a location that required workers to be suspended from ropes above the construction site just to reach the stone they needed to cut. Number 3. Taktsang Monastery. Your lungs are telling you something is wrong. You are at 10,240 feet above sea level, climbing a path in the Paro Valley of Bhutan, and the air here contains roughly 70% of the oxygen available at sea level. Your body is running a subtle deficit with every step. Ahead, hanging from a cliff face that drops 2,952 feet to the valley below, is a monastery. It doesn't sit at the edge of the cliff. It is part of the cliff. White-walled structures cling to the rock face in a way that defies immediate comprehension, not anchored to a ledge, not built in a sheltered notch, but suspended against sheer vertical stone at a height where the cliff offers nothing in the way of natural platform or foothold. The monastery appears to be growing from the mountain itself, as if the rock opened and the building stepped out. This is Taktsang Monastery, known in the West as Tiger's Nest. The structures date to 1692 CE, built during the reign of the Zhabdrung under the direction of Gyaltsen Tenzin Rabgi, but the site was considered sacred long before anyone built on it. According to Bhutanese tradition, the Indian master Guru Padmasambhava flew to this cliff face on the back of a tigress in the 8th century CE, landing at the cave that now forms the heart of the monastery's main shrine room. He meditated there for 3 months. Whether you accept that account or not, the material reality is this: the cave is there, the cliff is there, and in 1692, someone decided to build a functioning monastery around a cave, suspended 2,952 feet above a valley floor. Getting to Tiger's Nest requires a 2.5-hour hike on a maintained path that reaches 10,240 feet before arriving at a steel chain bridge, crossing a 200-foot waterfall. The bridge deposits you at the outer gate. This is the path that exists now. In 1692, there was no path. The cliff face has no natural ledges along the route the monastery required. Workers building the main structures had to be suspended from ropes above the construction site while simultaneously hauling materials upward. Every beam was carried on human backs up the valley path, every clay roof tile, every clay pot, every sack of flour and bag of lime plaster. At 10,240 feet, where a healthy, acclimatized adult operates at roughly 70% of sea-level aerobic capacity, construction workers were doing sustained heavy labor while attached to ropes against a 2,952-foot vertical face. The monastery's water supply comes from a spring located higher on the cliff than the monastery itself. Finding that spring required exploration of a cliff face that, by definition, cannot be walked, someone identified a water source, determined it could supply a community, and then engineered a channel to bring water from a point above the monastery down to the structures below. The channel runs along the cliff face. It was cut into the stone by people who were, at that moment, hundreds of feet above the valley with no permanent footing beneath them. But devotion explains motivation, not method. This is the distinction the mainstream account collapses. You can want very badly to build something on a cliff face at 10,240 feet and still die trying, because the engineering problems require solutions that desire alone does not supply. The workers who built Tiger's Nest needed rope technology capable of supporting a human body plus a load of construction materials for extended periods. They needed a coordination system for managing work across multiple levels of a vertical face simultaneously. They needed to know where the water was before they committed to building below it. These are technical problems that require technical answers, and the answers are not in any surviving document. In 1998, a fire destroyed significant portions of the monastery. The Bhutanese government organized a complete reconstruction using traditional methods. Workers slept in tents on the path below the cliff. Materials were again carried by hand up the valley and up the cliff. The reconstruction was completed in 2005, 7 years, from ruin to full restoration, at 10,240 feet, using the same techniques that produced the original. The reconstruction stands as proof of concept. The original method works. That proof makes the original less mysterious only in the narrowest sense. It confirms the outcome without explaining the knowledge. The cave at the monastery's core predates the 1692 structures by at least 9 centuries under traditional dating. Buddhist monks and nuns have maintained continuous presence at this location at 10,240 feet, above a 2,952-foot drop for over 1,300 years. The cliff has not changed. The oxygen content of the air has not changed. The question is not whether it was done. It was done twice. How do you teach successive generations to hang from ropes on a cliff face at altitude and build with the precision required to produce a structure that survives a fire, a complete rebuild, and 1,300 years of Himalayan weather? What was the knowledge tradition that made this possible, and what else was built using the same methods in places we haven't reached yet? From Bhutan's vertical monastery, we travel to a plateau in India, where the same impulse building the impossible in stone was expressed by removing 200,000 tons of mountain to find what was hidden inside. Number 4. The Kailasa Temple. You're standing at the rim of a plateau in Maharashtra, India, looking down, not into a valley, into a courtyard. A courtyard the size of a city block, 276 feet deep, 154 feet wide, cut straight down into the basalt rock of the Sahyadri Range at roughly 2,000 feet of elevation. At the center of this courtyard stands a temple, 100 feet tall, adorned with life-size elephant sculptures along its base. And here is the thing you need to understand about those elephants. They are not separate sculptures placed against the temple wall. They are the same continuous piece of rock as the temple above them, the floor beneath them, the perimeter walls surrounding you, and the courtyard you descended into. Everything you see is one object. One unbroken piece of basalt, from which everything else has been removed. A sculpture the size of a city block, revealed from the inside of a mountain. This is Cave 16 at the Ellora Caves in Maharashtra, India, the Kailasa Temple. It is the largest monolithic rock-cut structure on Earth. The Rashtrakuta king Dantadurga is credited with commissioning it in the 8th century CE. The mainstream construction timeline is approximately 18 years. Here is the arithmetic that has not been resolved. The temple required the removal of an estimated 200,000 tons of basalt. Basalt is one of the hardest stones in common geological use, rating a 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Iron chisels in basalt wear down quickly and require regular resharpening. To remove 200,000 tons of basalt in 18 years, working 7 months per year, the seasonal window before monsoons make cliff face work dangerous, the construction team would have needed to remove approximately 30 tons of basalt per working day, every working day, without interruption, for 18 consecutive years. That's not a workforce. That's an industrial operation. A 2015 structural engineering assessment of the Kailasa Temple concluded that achieving the cut tolerances visible throughout the structure, the precision of the figurative carving, the flatness of the pillar surfaces, the right-angle accuracy of the interior passages using iron tools and basalt wood, at minimum, have taken 150 years, not 18. The assessment didn't suggest the temple was impossible. It suggested the timeline documented in surviving inscriptions was wrong. What was actually happening here for the decades before Dantadurga's commission, and who was doing it? The construction method deepens the problem. Rock-cut architecture typically works horizontally. You excavate inward, retreat, and the structure grows outward from the mountain. The Kailasa Temple was constructed from the top down. Workers began at the plateau surface and removed material in descending layers, working downward into the rock. This means every cut was irreversible. There was no correcting an error after the fact. The sculptors working on the base-level elephant friezes at ground level of the finished courtyard were working on stone, whose dimensions had been fixed by cuts made 100 feet above them, months or years earlier, by different workers on a different section of the same single stone. An error in the upper carving would propagate through every lower element. The evidence of the finished structure shows no such propagated error. Across a 276 by 154-foot courtyard cut 100 feet deep into basalt, working top-down in irreversible cuts, they got it right. But the geometry problem is less strange than the debris problem. 200,000 tons of basalt were removed from this site. Basalt doesn't dissolve, and it doesn't evaporate. Every chisel stroke displaced a chip of one of the hardest stones in geological common use. Over 18 years of daily cutting, that displaced stone had to go somewhere. Archaeological surveys of the immediate area around the Ellora complex have not located a spoil heap consistent with this volume of material. Some of the removed stone may have been incorporated into later structures. Elsewhere on the Ellora site there are 34 cave complexes in the range, but the volume doesn't resolve. The bulk of 200,000 tons is, in the material record, absent. The drainage channels cut into the courtyard floor route seasonal rainwater away from the temple foundations at precisely calculated angles. They have functioned for 1,200 years without modification. The foundation shows no water damage despite annual monsoon rains. Before the courtyard was fully excavated, before the drainage channels could be tested, the engineers who designed this system already knew where the water would go. They cut the drainage solution into the floor during construction, before any rain had ever fallen into the courtyard they were creating. The mainstream explanation is organized labor on an extraordinary scale, with the 18-year timeline possibly representing the final decorative phase of a much longer ongoing excavation. It's possible. Surviving inscriptions credit Danti Durga, but do not describe what came before. The debris question is explained, in this account, by dispersal across a wide area over a long period. But where do the 200,000 tons go? Where did 150 years of construction activity go if the earlier phases happened? And who decided, before the first cut was made, to work top-down in irreversible strokes on one of the hardest stones available, in a structure where a single miscalculation at the top would ruin everything at the bottom, and then executed it without a single visible error across 100 feet of vertical depth? From a plateau in Maharashtra, we crossed to Bolivia at nearly twice the altitude, where the engineering mystery isn't measured in missing debris, it's measured in the precision of cuts that shouldn't be possible with any tool known to the civilization credited with making them. Number 5. Puma Punku. You are standing at 12,549 feet above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, and the air has roughly 40% less oxygen than you breathed at sea level this morning. Your heart rate is elevated. Your thinking moves slightly slower than usual. This is altitude sickness in its mild form, and it begins at this elevation in unacclimatized people within hours. Around you, scattered across several hundred yards of high-altitude plain, like the aftermath of something catastrophic, are stone blocks, not stacked, not arranged. Lying at angles, some half-buried, as if they were thrown there by an event so violent it scattered 100-ton stones the way a child tips over wooden blocks. One of these stones weighs 131 tons. The nearest quarry it could have come from is 56 miles away, across the Altiplano and across Lake Titicaca. You are standing at 12,549 feet. The stone weighs 131 tons. Someone moved it here, and no one fully agrees on how. This is Puma Punku, a section of the Tiwanaku archaeological complex on the Bolivian Altiplano near Lake Titicaca. The Tiwanaku civilization, which mainstream archaeology credits with constructing the site, reached its peak between approximately 500 CE and 900 CE. That is the consensus. The evidence is more complicated. The H blocks of Puma Punku are the objects that create the most difficulty for the mainstream account. They are andesite and red sandstone blocks, cut with right angles, internal channels, and recesses of unusual precision. The channels are uniform in width and depth along their entire length. The right angles are true right angles, not approximations. The surfaces are flat, not gradually flat over inches of variation, but flat to tolerances that modern machinists recognize as within the range of precision machining. In 1994, Arlen Andrews, a mechanical engineer and fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, examined the H-blocks and concluded that the cuts matched tolerances achieved by modern CNC machine tools rather than the range of variation expected from hand tool work in stone. Hand tool work in stone leaves characteristic marks: small arc-shaped depressions from the chisel tip, micro-fracturing patterns along cut edges. These marks are not consistently present on the H-blocks at Puma Punku. The blocks were not quarried locally. The red sandstone used in some elements comes from the Catamarca quarry, 56 miles away. The andesite comes from the Copacabana Peninsula, also on the far side of Lake Titicaca. The working theory for transport involves reed boat flotation across the lake, followed by land transport to the site. The reed boats of Lake Titicaca are documented. The Euros people still build them. But even assuming successful water transport of 131-ton blocks, the final overland section to the construction site at 12,549 feet involves terrain and elevation gain that a fully loaded transport system has to manage at an altitude where sustained heavy labor already degrades human performance by 40%. The chronology is the second problem. Carbon dating of organic material associated with the Tiwanaku site produces a range so wide it generates ongoing academic disagreement results spanning from approximately 1580 BCE to 1580 CE, more than 3,000 years. The mainstream consensus of 500 to 900 CE is the most defensible central estimate. But the German-Bolivian engineer Arthur Poznansky spent 50 years measuring the astronomical alignments of Tiwanaku's main structures and concluded, from precession calculations, that the site was built around 15,000 BCE, 10 times older than mainstream chronology. That date is not accepted by mainstream archaeology. It is, however, based on the same astronomical alignment mathematics used in other contexts to date ancient sites, and it produced a number that the consensus has criticized without, in the view of its proponents, conclusively refuting. The Altiplano itself adds a further dimension. The high plain of Bolivia was not always at this altitude. Geological evidence shows that the Lake Titicaca basin was once significantly lower. Fossilized saltwater marine organisms have been found in Altiplano sediment at elevations thousands of feet above sea level, indicating this land was at or near sea level at some point in the geological past. If the plateau rose significantly after initial occupation of the Tiwanaku site, then the people who began building here were not working at 12,549 feet. They were working somewhere closer to sea level. The site rose with the geology. The buildings, and their precision cuts, stayed where they were. The mainstream position is that the Tiwanaku civilization solved these problems through organized labor, generational construction, and transport engineering that, while impressive, falls within documented ancient capability. The reed boat hypothesis is reasonable. The precision of the H-blocks, according to mainstream archaeology, reflects skilled craftsmanship developed over centuries. The carbon dating ambiguity is a methodological problem shared by many ancient sites and does not by itself support extreme age claims. But precision cuts require precision cutting tools, and the tools leave traces. What technology produced sub-millimeter cuts in andesite at 12,549 feet in a period before the civilization credited with the work had any documented equivalent? What moved 131-ton blocks 56 miles at altitude? And if the Altiplano rose after initial construction, what was the original elevation of the site, and what does that change about when and by whom the first stones were placed? From Bolivia's high plain, we move northeast into the Himalayas, where the height barrier takes a different form. Not altitude sickness, but sheer vertical stone with no path to the top. Number 6. The Sky Caves of Mustang. You are hanging from a rope 155 feet above the canyon floor in Nepal's upper Mustang region. Below you, the Kali Gandaki River cuts through one of the deepest river gorges on Earth. Above you, carved into a vertical cliff face of compressed earth and soft conglomerate rock, is a cave mouth. Inside that cave, when you reach it, you will find painted murals, human bones, manuscripts written in scripts that have not been fully translated, and evidence of kitchen hearths used regularly enough to leave carbon deposits on the ceiling. The cave is one of approximately 10,000 carved into these cliff faces, most of them unreachable without modern climbing equipment, most of them at elevations between 13,000 and 14,000 feet. No one built ladders to them. No steps were cut into the cliff. They are up here, and whoever made them had a method of reaching them that we have not identified. Upper Mustang sits in the rain shadow of the Himalayas, sealed to outsiders until 1992, when the Nepalese government opened it to restricted access. Before that date, research was limited. After it, a series of expeditions began producing results that complicated every existing explanation. The sky caves of Mustang number approximately 10,000 individual chambers, carved into cliff faces rising between 100 and 400 feet above canyon floors. The oldest caves, dated via radiocarbon analysis of organic material found inside, go back at least 3,000 years. Some dates push to 3500 BCE, before the Bronze Age in most of the world. A 2007 National Geographic-funded expedition, led by researcher Marlon Bates, accessed 55 of the caves using modern technical climbing equipment. In one chamber, the team found the remains of 55 individuals, stacked in burial arrangements that indicated this space had been used for interment across multiple generations, over a period of at least 3 centuries. 3 centuries of sustained use. This was not a one-time refuge. The people using this cave came back, repeatedly, across multiple human lifetimes, to a chamber they had to climb 155 feet of sheer cliff face to reach. In other caves, the expedition found kitchen hearths with carbon deposits consistent with regular cooking, storage rooms with wooden structures still intact after millennia in the dry Himalayan air, painted murals depicting ceremonial figures in clothing, and ritual postures that predate Tibetan Buddhism in the region by centuries. The figures are not Buddhist. They belong to a religious tradition that existed in this part of the Himalayas before the dominant faith arrived, and, according to the murals, practiced its ceremonies at heights that required rope work to access. There is no water at cave level. The cliffs provide no springs. Whatever population used these caves for sustained occupation descended to the canyon floor for water and climbed back up. The Kali Gandaki River runs approximately 4,000 feet below the caves. A round trip from cave level to the river and back, at an altitude between 13,000 and 14,000 feet, represents a physical demand that would challenge modern high-altitude athletes. The people who lived here did it as routine, apparently for generations. The manuscripts found in the sky caves complicate the picture further. Some are in Tibetan expected, given Buddhist influence in the region, from the 8th century CE onward. But others are written in scripts that researchers from the Italian Archaeological Mission to Nepal identified as belonging to languages not yet fully catalogued from this region. The content of those manuscripts remains partially unknown. What portions have been translated include astronomical observations, medical texts, and what appear to be navigational references to routes across the Himalayan passes, information suggesting the cave communities were connected to a broader network, not isolated on their cliffs. But the mainstream explanation that the caves served as burial sites, meditation retreats, and seasonal refuges, not permanent homes, runs into a specific problem with the hearths. Carbon deposits from cooking fires accumulate at measurable rates. The deposits in Mustang caves correspond to continuous use cycles, not occasional visits. Hearths get a carbon layer from each use. The layers tell you how many times the hearth was lit. The hearths in these caves were lit many times, by people who were cooking meals at 155 feet of vertical cliff without a water source in reach, at 13,000 feet of elevation, in a cavity that required rope access every time you left and returned. That is not retreat behavior. That is domestic routine. Who cut 10,000 chambers into sheer cliffs at 13,000 feet in a region sealed from outside research until 1992? What necessity or knowledge drove a population to treat a daily 155-foot vertical climb as ordinary? What is in the manuscripts sitting in caves that still require a rope and a drop to access manuscripts in languages researchers have not fully read? And why did the people who built all of this leave no ground-level settlement anywhere in the canyon that accounts for a population large enough to carve 10,000 caves? From Nepal's vertical cliff faces, we cross the Caspian into the Caucasus, where a medieval queen took the logic of inaccessibility further than anyone and built an entire hidden city inside a mountain. Number 7. Vardzia. You're standing in the Maktveri River Gorge in southern Georgia, looking up at a cliff face of volcanic tuff on Mount Erusheti. The cliff is bare at first. Gray-brown volcanic stone, weathered and unremarkable, nothing worth stopping for. Then your eyes adjust and you start to see them. Windows, doorways, columns. The face of the cliff is riddled with openings, hundreds of them, arranged across 590 feet of vertical rock on 13 stacked levels. What you're looking at is a city, not carved from the surface, not built against the cliff. Carved into the interior of the mountain from a face that, before a specific earthquake in 1283 CE, showed nothing from the outside. Not a single window, not a single entrance. From the river gorge below, looking up for 127 years of the city's functional life, you would have seen only rock. That was the point. Vardzia was constructed under the Georgian king Georgi III, beginning around 1156 CE, and completed under his daughter, Queen Tamar, who ruled from 1184 to 1213 CE. The complex contains more than 3,000 rooms carved from volcanic tuff at 4,429 feet of elevation. Apartments, a church with original 12th century frescoes still vivid on the walls, a pharmacy with carved stone shelving still intact, a throne room, and wine cellars containing 185 clay wine vessels still in place after 800 years. The city was designed from the beginning as a hidden city, one that did not exist from the outside. The engineering of concealment is the most remarkable feature. The architects carved the interior rooms through tunnels that were themselves camouflaged. The only external openings were narrow ventilation shafts, invisible from the valley. Workers moved through the interior without creating visible excavations on the cliff face. The volume of material removed from inside Mount Erusheti, estimated at over 500,000 cubic feet of volcanic tuff, exited through disguised passages and was disposed of somewhere outside the visible cliff profile, because the face showed nothing throughout the construction period. A single tunnel connected the city to the Matkavari River at the cliff base, emerging through an exit invisible from the gorge. Residents could descend for water, move supplies upward, and return to the interior without appearing on the cliff face at any point in the journey. The water tunnel was the city's only physical connection to the outside world, and it was engineered to function as though it didn't exist. Queen Tamar's choice of Vardzia reflected a straightforward military calculation. The Mongol Empire was moving west. The Seljuk Turks had been raiding Georgian territory for a century. A city inside a mountain that appeared to be an unbroken cliff was a city that could not be besieged in the conventional sense. You cannot breach walls, you cannot see. You cannot starve a population that has a water tunnel, wine cellars, and an underground connection to the river. Vardzia made the defensive logic of inaccessibility into an architectural program. The earthquake of 1283 CE sheared away approximately a third of the cliff face that had concealed the interior. The hidden city became visible overnight. Rooms that had been interior spaces were suddenly open to the air. The invisibility that had protected Vardzia for 127 years was gone in a geological instant. Persian forces sacked the exposed complex in 1551 CE. The earthquake did more military damage in a moment than any army had managed in more than a century of trying. The construction timeline creates its own difficulty. The Georgian chronicles attribute the main construction phase to roughly 40 years, from Georgi III's commission around 1156 CE through Tamar's completion. In 40 years, working 7 months per year at 4,429 feet of elevation, a workforce had to carve 3,000 rooms, excavate a water tunnel to the river, construct a church with precision fresco plasterwork, and maintain the complete invisibility of the work from the gorge below, all while disposing of 500,000 cubic feet of volcanic tuff through hidden exits. Medieval construction at this scale typically left documentation, supply records, labor accounts, engineering plans. Vardzia's documentation is the chronicles, which describe what was built without describing how any of it stayed hidden. Volcanic tuff is softer than granite or basalt, and this is the mainstream account's strongest point. Carving tuff is within the reach of iron tools, producing reasonable volumes per day. The concealment of the work could have been maintained by controlling access to the gorge below and limiting the workers who knew the full scope. The earthquake is a geological fact, not a mystery. But 500,000 cubic feet of removed tuff had to go somewhere. The cliff face below Vardzia shows no debris deposit of that magnitude in the visible geological record. The material was either dispersed across a wide area over 40 years of secret disposal, a supply chain operating in concealment for 4 decades, or it was used internally in ways that left no visible evidence. The city the earthquake revealed was made of air. The mountain had been hollowed. Where did the mountain go? And if they could hide the construction of a 3,000-room city inside a cliff for 40 years, what else was built by the same people in the same mountains that no earthquake has yet revealed? From Georgia's volcanic gorge, we travel south to the Sri Lankan jungle, where a king put his palace on top of a 660-foot rock and then built a hydraulic system to put water up there with him, a system that still partially works today. Number 8. Sigiriya. You are at the base of a volcanic rock plug rising 660 feet straight up from the surrounding jungle in central Sri Lanka. The top is flat, a geological accident of erosion that left this column of hard gneiss standing after the softer rock around it wore away over millions of years. From where you're standing, the vertical faces are unbroken, no natural path, no accessible ledges. The rock goes up, and there is nowhere to go. But embedded in the stone at intervals ascending the face are iron staples, hammered into drilled holes. The staples are the original ones, placed there in 477 CE. They have been in the rock for more than 1,500 years. Someone climbed up here with iron and hammers and drilled holes into a 660-foot vertical cliff face, and then used those holes to build a palace on top of it. King Kashyapa I commissioned this. He had killed his father, King Datusena, by having him bricked into a wall alive. He then took the throne from his father's legitimate heir, his half-brother Moggallana, who fled to India with a declaration of war that was not an empty threat. Kashyapa needed somewhere to rule from that was also somewhere to survive from. He looked at a 660-foot volcanic plug rising from the jungle and built his palace on it. Construction ran from approximately 477 to 495 CE. The palace on the summit covers 3 acres. Getting water to the summit was the engineering problem that most concerns modern analysts. 3 acres of palace at 660 feet of elevation has no natural water source. Kashyapa's engineers built a hydraulic system that moved water from ground level to the summit, using a combination of cisterns, channels, and a pumping mechanism. The University of Moratua's engineering faculty studied the Sigiriya hydraulic system in 2003 and concluded that the summit water delivery used a mechanism they could identify as sophisticated but could not fully reconstruct from surviving physical evidence. The mechanism delivered water continuously to supply a residential palace complex. The scale of the vertical lift 660 feet using 5th century Sri Lankan engineering remains unexplained in detail. But the water gardens at the base are a different story. They remain one of the oldest formally landscaped gardens in the world, and they still function. The central water garden has 4 pools connected by channels, with marble fountains that still activate when the water table is high enough. The fountains operate on hydraulic pressure from underground pipes, a 1,500-year-old pressure system that requires no maintenance intervention to produce its original effect when conditions allow. The garden was not backup infrastructure. It was the hydraulic system's complement at ground level, and it outlasted the summit pump by 15 centuries. Running 600 feet along the cliff face at roughly mid-height is the mirror wall, a surface of polished white plaster applied to the rock on a narrow walkway cut into the stone. Kashyapa had it polished to the point where he could see his own reflection walking beside it. The polished surface survived 1,500 years of tropical humidity well enough that visitors from the 6th through 14th centuries scratched their names and poems into it, creating an accidental archive of everyone who walked this path across 800 years of pilgrimage. More than 1,500 individual inscriptions have been recorded. They are the world's oldest, continuously maintained graffiti collection. Kashyapa's mirror became a document. The Sigiriya frescoes are painted in a sheltered cavity 100 feet above the main gallery walkway, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase cut into the rock face. The The paintings depict women, dozens of them, from the waist up in vivid reds, yellows, and greens that have retained their intensity across 1,500 years of tropical humidity. According to 6th century accounts, there were originally 500 such figures painted across the face of the rock. Only 21 survive in the protected cavity. The rest are gone. What covered the rest of that cliff in 477 CE, and why it did not survive while 21 paintings in one sheltered section did, is a question the stone doesn't currently answer. Kashyapa's palace lasted 18 years. Moggallana returned from India in 495 CE with an army. Kashyapa rode out to meet him and, separated from his troops during the engagement, killed himself rather than be captured. The palace was abandoned within a generation and converted to a Buddhist monastery, which is likely why so much survived. Monks preserved what conquest would have dismantled. The summit hydraulic system, which pumped water 660 feet upward for 18 years, has been silent since 495 CE. The ground-level fountains still work. The mirror wall still reflects. The frescoes are still vivid. The iron staples are still in the rock. How do you pump water 660 feet straight up with 5th century technology in a way that leaves no surviving mechanism? What happened to the 479 frescoes that didn't survive in the protected section? And what does it mean that a king built all of this in 18 years? Palace, gardens, frescoes, mirror wall, and a hydraulic lift as a personal response to existential fear. And that the parts designed to last have lasted 1,500 years, while the part designed to move is the only element we can't explain. From Sri Lanka's jungle plateau, we return to the Andes, where a second Inca city, larger than Machu Picchu, has spent 5 centuries waiting in a canyon that takes 4 days to cross. Number 9. Choquequirao. You are 19 miles from the nearest road, on day 3 of a descent into the Apurimac Canyon. The trail dropped more than 5,000 feet this morning and will climb 4,800 feet this afternoon. The Apurimac River runs at the canyon floor, roughly 10,000 feet below the rim. This is the second deepest canyon in the world, and it is between you and where you're going. When you cross the suspension bridge at the bottom and begin the ascent on the far side, your lungs will remind you that you are climbing toward 10 feet above sea level. At the top of that ascent, on a ridge, with 4,000-foot drops on 3 sides, a city is waiting. A city larger than Machu Picchu. A city that fewer than 30,000 people visit in an entire year, compared to the 5,000 who pass through Machu Picchu's gate every single day. You are going to one of the largest Inca sites in existence, and you are going to it essentially alone. Choquequirao was built in the late 15th century CE, contemporary with Machu Picchu, and believed to have been a royal estate of the Inca Emperor Tupac Yupanqui. After the Spanish conquered Cusco in 1533, the Inca resistance retreated into the mountains. Choquequirao is believed by some researchers to have served as an alternative capital, a fallback position in a location no Spanish expedition could reach at sustainable cost. The Apurimac Canyon was not a natural feature to work around. It was a wall. The site covers approximately 1,800 acres. Machu Picchu covers 80. Only 30% of Choquequirao has been excavated. The remaining 70% lies under vegetation on a ridge, accessible only by the route you've just spent 3 days walking. Mules cannot complete the final ascent. Every tool, every supply, every piece of equipment at an active excavation site here must be carried by a person. This is why 70% of a 1,800-acre Inca city, larger than Machu Picchu in every dimension, has remained unexcavated for more than a century of archaeological awareness. The agricultural terraces of Choquequirao extend for more than a mile along the ridgeline. They are engineered terraces, stone-faced and deep-soiled, designed to hold topsoil and manage water at 10,010 feet. The soil they contain was not native to the ridge. The ridge is rock. The topsoil was transported from below, carried up the same 4,800-foot ascent you've been climbing since this morning, deposited in stone-faced containers, and maintained as agricultural land, producing food for a city population at an altitude where agriculture is already marginal. This represents an investment in infrastructure whose purpose only makes sense if someone expected to be here for a very long time. The llama terraces are what no one fully explains. On a section of the lower terraces below the main ceremonial area, a series of retaining walls are decorated with inlaid white stone figures of lamas, each figure roughly 2 feet tall, set into the dark stone at intervals across multiple terrace levels. There are 24 of them. They are only visible from directly above, looking down from the ridge onto the terraces below. From terrace level, you see only stone wall. From the air above the ridge, the lamas appear in procession along the hillside. The Inca had no aircraft. No one who built these figures could have seen them from the angle that makes them visible in the form we observe today. The decoration was made for a perspective that, as far as we know, no person in the 15th century CE could occupy. Peruvian authorities announced plans for a cable car to Choquequirao in 2015. The proposal would have reduced access time from a 4-day trek to 15 minutes, potentially transforming visitor numbers toward the Machu Picchu range of 1.8 million per year. As of 2024, the cable car has not been built. The environmental impact assessment raised concerns about the effect on a site where 70% of the archaeology is still underground and undisturbed. The isolation that has preserved Choquequirao for 500 years is also, precisely, what has made it scientifically valuable. The canyon protected it from the Spanish. The same canyon has, incidentally, protected it from the kind of mass tourism that has altered the archaeology at Machu Picchu. The Spanish searched systematically for Inca-resistant sites after 1533. Their records document campaigns into the highlands, punitive expeditions, systematic site destruction. They did not find Choquequirao. The canyon between them and the ridge was an obstacle that made the search not worth the cost. The Inca built cities in places that armies could not follow, not because the engineering was easy, but because the difficulty of the location was itself the defense. 70% of this city is still in the ground. The Lama terraces are decorated for a viewer who has no business being at that vantage point in the 15th century. The transport of topsoil up a 4,800-foot ascent to a 1,800-acre site represents a commitment whose full purpose remains unclear. What is underneath the unexcavated sections of a city larger than Machu Picchu, hidden in a canyon that takes 4 days to cross? Whatever it has been waiting 500 years. The canyon is still there. From Peru's hidden canyon city, we make the final ascent to the highest point on this list, 16,340 feet above sea level, at the base of the highest mountain on Earth, where a community has been living permanently for over a century at an altitude where, medically speaking, permanent habitation should not be possible. Number 10. Rongbuk Monastery. You are at 16,340 feet above sea level. The air here contains less than half the oxygen available at sea level. You have been climbing for weeks, acclimatizing slowly, because arriving at this altitude too quickly can kill you. Your lungs work twice as hard to extract the same useful oxygen from each breath. Your blood has thickened, your body generating more red blood cells than your marrow usually produces, in a physiological scramble to compensate for an atmosphere that is not adequate for sustained human activity. In front of you is a whitewashed monastery. Prayer flags snap in wind, cold enough to crack exposed skin in minutes. Behind the monastery, visible over its roofline in a way that collapses the scale of everything near you, is Mount Everest, not the summit, the face. 3 miles of vertical rock and ice rising from a valley that is already, at your feet, the highest permanently inhabited place on Earth. Rongbuk Monastery sits at 16,340 feet in the Rongbuk Valley of Tibet, at the base of Everest's north face. It is the highest permanently occupied religious building on Earth. Formally established in 1902 by the Nyingma Lama Ngawang Tenzin Norbu, the site had been used for solitary meditation practice since at least the 15th century CE. Someone was choosing to be here at 16,340 feet, in a valley that channels glacial wind directly off the ice above 5 centuries before it had walls. The community of monks and nuns who maintain Rongbuk lives here year-round, not seasonally, not with breaks for lower elevations. Year-round, at 16,340 feet. Standard high-altitude medicine describes sustained permanent habitation above 14,000 feet as producing documented physiological costs: reduced fertility, chronic sleep disruption, elevated blood pressure, accelerated red blood cell turnover. and impaired immune function. Tibetan populations carry a genetic adaptation in the EPAS, one gene that permits more efficient oxygen use, refined over generations of highland habitation. But even with that adaptation, the long-term physiological toll of 16,340 feet is measurable and real. Rongbuk's community has been accepting those costs, voluntarily, as the price of being in this specific place, for more than a century of institutional life, and for far longer as individual practice. The practical arithmetic of survival at 16,340 feet is straightforward and brutal. The boiling point of water here is approximately 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooking requires pressure vessels or extended methods. Agriculture is impossible at this elevation. The growing season is 0 days per year. Every calorie consumed at Rongbuk Monastery must be carried up the Rongbuk Valley from lower elevations by yak or by hand, on the same route that early British Everest expeditions used to reach their base camp. The monastery does not sustain itself. It sustains itself through the labor of supply chains maintained by people who consider the effort worthwhile. The first major Western Everest expeditions used Rongbuk as their staging point. The 1922 British expedition, led by General Charles Bruce, and the 1924 expedition, during which George Mallory and Andrew Irvine disappeared near the summit, both operated from the Rongbuk Glacier immediately adjacent to the monastery. George Mallory's journals, from 1922, record his first encounter with the resident community. He noted that the monks and nuns at Rongbuk appeared entirely indifferent to the altitude that was driving his experienced mountaineers onto supplemental oxygen during acclimatization hikes. The British climbers were struggling at elevations where the residents were performing daily domestic labor. The contrast was, by Mallory's account, both striking and unexplained. The monastery was largely destroyed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1969, when thousands of Tibetan religious sites were demolished across the plateau. After the Cultural Revolution ended, the Rongbuk community rebuilt. They carried materials up the Rongbuk Valley on yak and on their own backs. They reconstructed walls and shrines and prayer halls at 16,340 feet, in a valley swept by glacial wind at the base of the highest mountain on earth, because this was where the practice had always been conducted, and this was where it would continue. The rebuilt monastery was consecrated in the 1980s. The community is still there. Inside, Thangka paintings and manuscript texts were documented by early Western visitors before the Cultural Revolution, but have been largely inaccessible to outside researchers since the region was closed to independent scholars. What survived the destruction, what was hidden before the demolition teams arrived, and what knowledge exists in the records of a community that has been maintaining high-altitude habitation practice for 5 centuries? These questions currently have no available answers. These 10 places a granite ridge at 7,970 feet, where water flows uphill through channels cut by people using bronze tools. A desert basin at 2,700 feet, hidden inside 400 square miles of engineered water capture. A cliff face at 10,240 feet, where a monastery was built by workers, suspended on ropes above the foundation. A basalt plateau at 2,000 feet, where 200,000 tons of stone disappeared. An altiplano at 12,549 feet, where blocks arrived from 56 miles away, with cuts no tool has explained. Cliff cavities at 13,000 feet, where kitchen hearths were lit routinely without a water source in reach. A mountain interior at 4,429 feet, hollowed in secret for 40 years, without a visible trace. A volcanic plug at 660 feet above the jungle, with a hydraulic system no one has fully reconstructed. An Andean canyon city at 10,010 feet with terraces decorated for a viewpoint that didn't exist. And a monastery at 16,340 feet, where people live year-round at an altitude that medicine says they shouldn't all share one characteristic. In every case, the people who built here chose the hardest option available, not the most practical location, not the most accessible ridge, the most difficult place they could reach, and then the most permanent structure they could build in it. Every single time. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern, and the pattern means something. If you want to keep exploring places that shouldn't exist, subscribe and stay here. If you're watching this from somewhere with actual altitude, leave it in the comments. And if something in this video changed how you think about what ancient people were capable of, share it with someone who still thinks history is simple.